You're listening to WVOF 88.5, Fairfield University, and this is The Sweep with yours truly, Ali Haidar.
And I'm Cole Townsend.
The Sweep is an unapologetically progressive talk show in which we discuss wedge issues and a range of topics in a progressive perspective, one that is rarely conveyed in the mainstream media. On today's episode, we will be discussing the topic of undocumented immigration in America. We are joined with two friends of the show, Bob George and Jay Glover. Bob is a Fairfield University mathematics major and econ minor who has worked for the United States Citizenship and Immigration Services and has recently finished up a capstone which analyzes the impact of undocumented immigrants on state GDPs. Jay, on the other hand, has worn many hats in his life, from a touring musician to a high-rolling banker, but today he's the minister here on Fairfield University's campus and is dedicated to promoting tolerance and social justice. He recently led a group of Fairfield volunteers to the Arizona border where they learned more about the human side to immigration, which often gets drowned out. So, Bob and Jay, thank you both for joining us. So, Jay, we'll start with you. Jay, can you please explain broadly about your trip to the border?
Well, first, I'd just like to say thank you for having me here. It's a pleasure to be amongst my good friends from the lounge, as I call it. It's a place that I've, in the year that I've been here, that's been the location that I've been most drawn to, and I find the most stimulating conversation and a feeling of genuine love. So now, you want to know about the border trip?
We want to know the details, Jay.
You want to know the details. Okay, well, the goal was to take the students down to not Arizona, but we went down to San Diego where the California border meets Tijuana. And it was there that we got to see firsthand what the wall actually looked like. We got to see the suffering live and in color that goes on, that's involved and surrounds this entire border, the complexities of this border and migration issues. But in order to prepare us for actually going there, we went through a series of conversations and workshops to heighten our sensitivities to the harshness of the realities of what we might see. But anyway, arriving at the actual border, we met with Border Patrol. And the Border Patrol agents, they were very nice to us. They spoke, they told us about the struggles that they face, part of which is they're being underfunded. Mm-hmm. So one of the agents described to me that they will send even a female border agent out into the rugged, mountainous terrain in the middle of the night with a pistol and handcuffs to arrest whatever migrants she comes across, which may be as many as 20. As you know, the demographic has changed from a 25-year-old Mexican man coming across the border from Tijuana into the United States. The demographic now is families coming, men, women, and children coming from as far away as the Honduras and Central America. Mm-hmm. The sad part is that people are dying in the desert. Mm-hmm. And, whether or not you believe there should be open borders or closed borders or the border should be shut down or whether or not there should be more personnel for Border Patrol or some higher level of technology, at the end of the day, people are dying in the desert. Mm-hmm. And the deaths are often blamed on the wall. There are some people out there, if you have the opportunity to look up a researcher, Mr. Enrique Morones, he's the executive director of the Border Angels. You can find him on YouTube. He insists that the wall itself has caused 11,000 deaths since it's been up. And this is because people are being forced now to come around the wall, through the desert, through the oceans, and they're losing their lives.
Mm-hmm. So you said that you saw a lot of suffering going on. Were you able to see any migrants or undocumented immigrants come through the border, or were you able to meet a few? Or
well, while we were speaking with the Border Patrol, They gave us a very nice presentation, and now we were going to journey to get a little closer to the wall, the actual wall of the primary and the secondary fence, which constitutes the wall in between Tijuana and the United States. So while we were walking along this path through the desert, dust, and bush, heading towards the Pacific Ocean, a border patrol van pulled up, and the guy jumps out and runs into the bush and comes out about 10 minutes later with two migrants that were on this side of the wall. Mm-hmm. So obviously, the wall is ineffective. Mm-hmm. Besides, it's ineffective in more ways than one. Besides the fact that I believe it covers a third of the stretch of the actual border, which
just
may
about,
be,
yeah.
So it covers about a third, right? And in that third, there are stretches of a fence, and then there's a big gap, and then there's more stretches of the fence and another gap. So it's highly ineffective. We're right there, and here these two guys pop up in the bushes. Right in front of the wall, and to my surprise, when we asked the border agents about the volume of arrests that they make at this location, she told me that we're making 150 apprehensions per day.
Wow.
Now, I just want to say, because it's interesting that you mentioned that the border wall as we have it is pretty ineffective. Because it's not just ineffective, it's actually counterintuitive. So, if you look at the history of migration across the southern border in this country, initially what we had was circular migration, wherein, men at the time, they were usually Mexican men, as opposed to from other South and Latin American countries. But they would come in, they would work a little while in the United States, which worked pretty well sometimes because we would need, increases in labor depending on the season, and then they would return home, and they would have money to spend on their families, right? And that was why we had that demographic you described earlier of young men around 25 crossing through. When Reagan decided to strengthen the border wall and weaponize the border, because it became so dangerous to go across, it was no longer something where you could just permeate through when you needed to and go back home. And so as a result, but migrants began having to bring their entire families across. Whether that was in one big group or, a few at a time or one at a time, so that they could stay in the U.S. permanently instead of returning home. So to the extent that there is a migration problem in the first place, along the southern border, it would definitely be the consequence of that kind of militant policy.
Well, not only that, but the NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, which it allows commerce but not people to cross borders. There are still people who are working. We were there at a point of entry, a legal point of entry, and there's a mall right there, and it's called Mall at the Border. That's how the sign advertised it, and that's a big billboard, Mall.
So my question is, and you said that the Border Patrol agent told you that they were making around 150 apprehensions. They're arresting 150 people per day. Were you able to get another figure from someone else? You spoke of someone who, I believe, what was the group called?
Border Angels.
Border Angels. Did they give you a statistic about that? Because I'm not trying to discredit the border agent, but I know that when law enforcement gives certain statistics in a way, especially relating to how they work, it might be a little misleading if that is the case. But were you able to get any other certain statistics?
No, that was enough for me.
Mm-hmm. So
I believe them. I really do. It's just really sad to see people coming out. There are people that still come across those legal entry points, and they work in the mall and they go home. So they do still have that in place. But the problem is, one of the problems is that there's really, some people say, well, why don't they just get in line and apply like they're supposed to? There is no line. So the building of more wall would, in fact, some believe, just contribute to more deaths.
Absolutely, yeah.
I mean, just looking at the border, I mean, the Rio Grande River makes up a significant portion of it, and from what I understand, and maybe Jay, you could elaborate on this if you're able to see this. A lot of migrant deaths, like you said, come from people, walking through the desert, but also I wonder how many people die from just swimming across that large river.
Right. So they're dying on the trains. I saw a film, if you ever get a chance to watch it, it's called Which Way Home. Mm-hmm. And this film shows the journey of migrants, even as young as 9 years old, riding on the tops of freight trains. And, a kid may fall asleep on the top of a freight train and fall off the train and die. So there are many deaths that occur on the trains. There are deaths that occur crossing the rivers. They find dead bodies floating through the rivers every day. Then we were at the section of the wall that we were actually at, extended out into the Pacific Ocean for about 100 yards. People drowned in rivers. They drowned in the ocean. People climb over the wall. I mean, if you have a 15-foot wall, you have a 16-foot ladder. And
Absolutely.
And it doesn't stop people. So more wall will not stop people, but it will contribute to the deaths that happen.
So I guess, and I'll ask this of the field, Jay and Bob and Colin, but particularly, so 150 arrests per day. Does that mean, is it a crisis at the southern border? Is this a crisis going on? A lot of people will say no, a lot of people will say yes. The president and his administration will say yes, there's a crisis at the border. People from the progressive side will say there's no crisis on the border, but because you have a first-hand experience, and like I said, I'll ask the field, does this mean there's a crisis at the border?
Well, I would definitely argue that there is no real crisis at the border. It's largely fabricated. Do we have, a degree of immigration coming across the border illegally? Yes. However, undocumented immigration across that border in particular has tapered off since 2011. It plateaued, and we've had a net immigration of essentially zero ever since. So the fact that people keep trying to portray it as if things are only getting worse and we're only seeing the beginning is absolutely preposterous, and it's just fallacious and untrue. And if you look, the majority of, undocumented immigrants that come here come from legal ports of entry, whether that's in the actual border wall or, from a plane where they have a visa or something like that, and they overstay. But that is completely different from, this massive wave of, illegal immigration, as they keep calling it. And even if that was the case, we do have to accept some responsibility for that. Like we've discussed already, a lot of the immigration is no longer coming just from Mexico. It's coming from all of, that entire region. And why? Well, climate change, as they're very close to the equator, in many cases on the equator, affects them disproportionately. We're one of the largest purveyors of climate change, and even when we're not, we do a lot of business with China, who produce things who have also contributed quite a lot to climate change. So, in a large sense, we are to blame for that. And then let's not forget about the destabilization in the region caused by the dirty wars in the 80s, where we decided to get rid of numerous democratically elected leaders so we could install pro-United States essentially, dictators, leaders, whatever you want to call them. And we still see the political ramifications of that. And one of them is this, migration across the border.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I mean, just going off the whole dirty wars thing, like we've discussed on the show, a lot of the reasons why, the Central America or, other regions, South America, the Middle East, Africa, a reason why, even Southeast Asia, a reason why we have, large amounts of people leaving or a lot of issues happening in those regions is because back in the 20th century, the United States would overthrow governments in a way which is maybe a direct or indirect way of colonialism, imperialism, mm-hmm. and we're reaping what we sowed back then. And so, I saw you jump up when Colin said that there's been a net immigration of zero. Was there any talk of that when you went to the border, or did anyone mention anything about that?
Well, people are leaving
mm-hmm.
here.
Going to Canada.
Yeah, people are leaving here in record numbers. And over time, if you look at a decade or so, although it may appear that the numbers are up at this moment, over a decade, looking backward, it shows that the migration is actually down, especially from Mexico because of the increase of people coming from other areas like Guatemala, Salvador, and the Honduras. But the crisis, you asked about the crisis, is there really a crisis? And I would say this, the crisis is partly due to the detention practices that are occurring at the border. It's my understanding that under the Obama administration, there was they would give ankle bracelets and send the people to be with their families here on this side until their applications were approved and all of that. I understand under the Obama administration they had representatives in embassies in other places that the application for asylum could be made there locally as opposed to having to cross over illegally and risk your life on the train through the river or 20 days in the desert. And so that's the crisis. The other crisis is so it's the not only is ICE. This is what happens. The Border Patrol arrests the migrants. They try to find out who they are. They arrest them and they have a little jail, right? And then they turn them over to ICE, who detains them. And the problem is that ICE is now, the detention centers are filled to beyond capacity, and Border Patrol is now having to hold the people in their detention centers longer than they would like to. They were not built for that. So they're building all sorts of crazy makeshift detention centers under bridges. And these are men, women, and children. Children are being separated from their parents. And I'll tell you this, man, I just have to say this before I forget. One of the most evil things that I saw, I'm a man of faith, and I think that I'm really concerned with the humanitarian aspect of all of this. One of the most evil things I saw down there was the border angels. One of the things they do is they go down and they make water drops into the desert. They'll drive out for 2.5 to 3 hours into the desert, right? And then they'll hike for another 2 hours out into the desert, and they come across dead bodies and bones. So what they do is they do water drops, dropping plastic gallon jugs of water all along the trail. So that person who, he's coming around the corner, perhaps with his last few breaths, or his last, the sun, the heat, the 120 degrees may just cook your organs, right? And so here he comes around the corner, he sees something twinkle, and it's a bottle of water. And this makes the difference of life and death. Then, on the other side, you have groups of people that call themselves patriots that will come behind them and slash the jars open so that the water spills out. They accuse the Border Angels and other groups, like No More Death Group, of assisting and aiding illegal entry into the country. So they consider them criminals, and some of them have actually been arrested. No,
I mean, definitely. I mean, the Secretary of Homeland Security just resigned. In a way, she was kind of forced to step out, and she was the one who orchestrated with the guide of the president and his administration of separating children from their families. And we're still seeing the repercussions to this day, right? Even though they've allegedly stopped the policy, the psychological trauma that's inflicted on these children and on the parents is really it's lifetime. It's lifelong. So going over so when you were down on the border, did you see any, you speak of the Border Angels, were there any other consequential leaders within the Latinx community? Anyone that really stood out to you particularly, or anything like that? Well, you have the San Diego barrio, the ghetto, is there's a park there called Chicano Park. And it was an area that was, marginalized, underserved area, which people of lower incomes lived there. And the government built that freeway through this area. And their next plan was to build a police station there and displace people from their homes. So the activist groups protested back in the 70s. The activist groups, they protested, they fought, and they took the land, and they created what's now known as Chicano Park, and it's now a landmark.
there's a gentleman, Rigo Reyes, who is a leading activist voice there in the Chicano community, who has fought diligently for 30 years for promoting the continuity and the promotion of their culture and the preservation of their history. Rigo Reyes and his organization called UIV, I believe. There are other people, but I think that the political side is the political struggle. I mean, this was one of my comments while we were there, that the promotion of the culture and the tradition and all of that is fine. It's really beautiful, and it helps people to have something to hold on to. But I thought what was lacking was other than the Border Angels and maybe some groups that I'm not aware of, but the political struggle seemed to be lacking in intensity. We went to the University of San Diego. We sat with a professor in his class, and my comment to him was that I see that who's engaging this political fighting for policy change. I don't see it happening. And again, maybe I just don't know. But it's open. It's an open space for change that needs to be filled.
Oh, absolutely.
Well, definitely. I know, once again, referencing our race, class, and politics or the politics of race, class, and gender class that we have together, we have actually discussed, the Latino movement or lack thereof in this country and a few, suspect causes. And they go back to, one, a lack of localized control. That's really important. And, for example, if you remember, Black Wall Street, which I know, Jay, you and I have talked about together, where you saw, blacks be able to take control of their own localized economy, and, even further beyond that, their own emergency services, et cetera. They did exceedingly well for themselves and started becoming very wealthy. Latinos have yet to achieve that in any, large way. Perhaps this Chicano Park could be the start of it, because you did mention that they were able to fight essentially the displacement and the gentrification, and preserve their own community and locality, which is great to hear. But also, when it comes to movement, to compare them once again to the black movement, you had one solid migration period over the course of slavery, and that is for the most part how most African Americans or blacks got to this country. Whereas with Latinos, there's a constant wave of migration. So with that, and the fact that these groups are very different from each other, for example, a Cuban, their culture and their political background could be very different from that of, a Mexican or an El Salvadorian. It does make sense that, a lot of times you don't see those leadership groups crop up as much. But I definitely agree. I would not mind seeing some broader engagement. I was hoping initially that the one good thing that would come out of, this very negative force that is Donald Trump and his war on Latinos, particularly Mexicans, and immigration would be that hopefully you would start to see them take up a more pivotal role in politics. They felt threatened. So far, we're yet to see that, but hopefully in the future we do.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, so going off of that, so I guess one of my questions, and this we'll get more into this with what Bob's research later, but for you, Jay, and we've kind of covered this already. The Secretary of Homeland Security just resigned. The president announced that he's cutting aid to these Central American countries. So the question is, and like we've mentioned this, if the wall isn't a good idea, which none of us think is a good idea, what policy solutions do you think we should go through? What do you suggest? I know this is more political, and
we're putting you on the spot.
What do you think?
Well, I'll tell you what I think. I sent an email to Enrique this morning,
okay,
and asked him, "What do you think?" Because they said to me, "Listen, everybody's talking about us in Washington, and nobody's talking to us." So I actually sent that email to him this morning. Enrique, by the way, what would you like to see happen? And in conversation down there, one gentleman told me, "Well, I would like to see it go back to no borders, like it was when I was a child." Because this is what it's compared to. Imagine if there's a wall constructed between the Bronx and Harlem, and you have family on both sides. Now you can no longer see your family. The economic, the interdependency on both sides of that wall suffers. they built a place there next at Tijuana and San Diego. They built a place called Friendship Wall. And this is their effort to make things better. What it does is there's a primary fence and a secondary fence. They open the secondary fence door on the U.S. side. They open it up for, I think, a couple of hours, and they allow 10 people to go in between that space, between the primary wall and the secondary wall, and through little holes in the fence, they can touch their family on the other side. They touch their fingers like that.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the improvement that's happened thus far. It's far from any political and policy change. So, again, that was my question to them. And I didn't get an answer on that question. But I'm pretty sure that Enrique, when he answers my email, he's going to come back with a whole laundry list of policy changes.
Definitely. So, like we mentioned on the show, and one thing me and Colin, been really good proponents of is, and this goes counter to what the president's recent policy is if you want to stop what the president calls a crisis on the border, whatever you want to call it, you should fund the countries that these people are coming from. In a way, similarly, like called the Marshall Plan for Central America. Instead of cutting funding to the countries that need it, give it to them. Right? We rebuilt Europe after World War II because we were afraid of a right-wing government rising again and doing the exact same thing that Nazi Germany did. So that's something we've been pushing hard. But in terms of the border, I don't know. Certainly what Rigo, right? What he said, it's crazy how he grew up without a border. Now today, borders are something that everyone keeps thinking about. It really shows how the landscape has changed from society and even in the political sphere.
Well, I know that we probably should be going to break, but before we do, I do want to hit on something you said about the Marshall Plan, because, that's really pivotal. And if you take a look, right, what is the difference between how Germany and Russia, and why, Russia has been so aggressive in the global sphere, whereas Germany has been a real team player for the most part, right? It has to do with the fact that because we did not want another Nazi Germany to rise up, we and the West as a whole held hands with Germany the entire way. With Russia, we really did not do that. And as a result, you've seen instability, you've seen authoritarianism really rise up, disguised as democracy. Even Japan, right? We have a very close, relationship with Japan, probably, our closest Pacific partner. And how did that happen, even though we were, obviously very militarily engaged against one another? It is because we stayed to an extent and assisted them with rebuilding their economy and their technology afterwards. So it should be no different for these Latin American countries. As I've stated already, we are a driving factor in the instability of the region. And, we talked about this in the last show where Fox News called it Mexican countries that we removed aid from. But truly, we should be giving out aid to these countries and in a way that does not make them subservient or, subsistent to the U.S., but just in a way that is truly benevolent and truly allows them to stand on their own.
Definitely, absolutely. So those of you listening, thank you for listening to The Sweep. We'll be right back after this quick break, and we'll be focusing on Bob's analysis. So please stick around.
Mom, can I have $1?
My purse is upstairs on my bed.
It's not here.
What about your sister's room?
Nope.
The upstairs closet?
No.
The downstairs closet?
Mom, there are no more closets.
I'm sorry, honey. It was right here all along.
Moms everywhere are finding ways to keep their kids active and healthy. Get ideas, get involved, get going at letsmove.gov. Brought to you by the USDA, HHS, and the Ad Council.
At the football game, Jim shows the telltale signs of being wasted. He attempts to high-five everyone on the way to his section, spilling his $10 beer everywhere. Back in his seat, he screams, "Defense." His friends remind him it's halftime. He takes off his shirt and starts flexing for the camera. He refers to his muscles as gunboats. Jim screams, "How's this for a halftime show?" He tells the story about the time he flexed for the halftime show. His friend informs him that it just happened. To redeem himself, he streaks the field. Jim makes it to midfield before being tackled. The Jumbotron captures it all.
It's easy to tell if you've had way too many to drive. But what if you've had just one too many to drive? Never underestimate just a few. Buzz driving is drunk driving. A public service announcement brought to you by the U.S. Department of Transportation, the Ad Council, and this station.
You're listening to WVOF 80.5 Fairview University, and this is The Sweep with yours truly, Ali Haidar.
And I'm Cole Townsend.
And we're back. Today we're joined with two lovely guests, Jay Glover and Bob George. Earlier we heard about Jay's really emotional and really descriptive,
experience at the border, yeah.
Experience. So, and so thank you, Jay, for telling us. And so we'll be moving on to the more logistics, more policy. So our friend Bob George, for his capstone project, wrote a paper about an analysis about the impact of undocumented immigrants in state GDP. So Bob, can you please explain to us the scope of your recent research? And with that being said, what were the results? Were there anything particularly surprising? Anything related that can corroborate what Jade has told us? Anything in particular?
Sure. Thank you so much, you two, for letting me come on the show today. So just before I go into all that, I just want to give a little bit of background, just some other things I wanted to bring up. So in 2018, there was a survey done by the Pew Research Center, and it even says the most pressing political issue in our society today is immigration. And it's big right now, especially this has been a major point in the Trump administration. According to whitehouse.org on November 1st, 2018, President Trump comes out and says that illegal immigration hurts American workers, burdens American taxpayers, and undermines public safety, and places enormous strain on local schools, hospitals, and communities in general, taking precious resources away from the poorest Americans who need them the most. Illegal immigration costs our country billions and billions of dollars each year, and all the news outlets, they all have their own personal opinions, but there's a lack of a truly concrete, unbiased, pure statistical analysis, and that's what the goal of my research to do. So I wanted to build a regression analysis model that measures gross domestic product, or GDP, and one of my major variables I would look at is just the sheer number of undocumented citizens between all states and Washington, D.C. from 2005 and 2017. Other independent variables that were used were the unemployment rates as well as education levels. In my case, how many people had a bachelor degree or higher. The results were extremely good, kind of what you would expect. Like, for example, as the unemployment rate increases, GDP is going to decrease. But specifically with the case of undocumented citizens, for GDP per capita, I found that if you increase the number of undocumented citizens by 1%, that leads to a $7,000 increase in GDP per capita, which means every single person in that state or D.C. has an additional $7,000 of revenue, which is pretty big. That's pretty substantial. Then I decided to look at the fact that, well, of course, if you're going to talk about undocumented citizens, what about the legal citizens? So I added in a new independent variable, which is going to be the natural log of number of legal citizens in the United States, and the results were still, everything was significant, everything checked out, model was robust, and the fact that if I were to increase the number of undocumented citizens by 1%, that yields a 0.2% increase to a state's or DC's GDP. So overall, the results were indicating the fact that, in general, undocumented citizens are good and important for the U.S. economy. They contribute to economic growth. Do they make as much of an impact as legal citizens? No, but that's kind of what you would expect, and it's still important to acknowledge the fact that these undocumented citizens have an important impact in our economy.
And so, I know you talked about, what was it? You spoke about discussing, not just, illegal immigration, I guess you'd say, but also God, I'm actually blanking here. My bad.
All good.
Colin recollects his thoughts. I guess my question, Bob, is where does that money come from? Like the 2% GDP, the $7,000 per capita. What is that a result of? Is it because undocumented immigrants work more, they produce more, or what is it? Do you know why that happens?
So there are a couple of reasons I found. One of the major ones was the fact that, so a lot of people think, okay, undocumented citizens, they burn the U.S. economy, they take away our jobs, they hurt the fact that they don't generate income tax. But in reality, when you look at it, that's not exactly the case. Because of the fact that America's education laws mean so many people have those high school diplomas when they graduate, there's actually a very large demand in the job market for those for very unskilled work. Your house cleaners, your cooks, your janitors, your laundrymen, those kind of guys. And illegal immigrants fill that market gap almost perfectly. So they actually fulfill a very important and niche part of the U.S. labor market. Another thing to consider on the tax level is the fact that, sure, a lot of them don't pay direct income tax, but that also means they're not getting Medicaid, they're not getting Medicare, they're not getting Social Security. They still have to pay things like income tax, unless you're in Delaware. Or they still have to pay rent to their homeowner, and the homeowner still has to pay the property tax. So they are paying a lot of taxes that we tend to forget, even though the big one isn't there. So those are a couple of reasons why I generally found that they did contribute to the U.S. GDP or GDP per capita.
So I managed to recollect my thoughts finally. Sorry about that failure
about
before. But so essentially, right? You discussed, personally with us about your research that you found a few states where, in the sake of being, totally fair, open, and honest, where undocumented immigration had a negative effect, I believe, on GDP, and a few where they had a neutral or statistically irrelevant effect on GDP. I believe the net average was still that it was very positive, but can you just go into those states, and do you have any idea why they would be negative in certain states, whereas they were positive in the vast majority?
Sure. Okay. So the model and the results I presented was actually the statistical average from all the different states in D.C. The data was taken from 2005 to 2017, so I had over 600 observations to work with. So it still indicates that overall, on average, it was very, positive results. But the big states, when I did actually broke it down by state, California was huge. Like California, New York, the states you would kind of expect, but still important to point out, they had the most biggest impacts where illegal immigrants were a factor there. There were some states where it wasn't that good. I think it was kind of negative in Utah. Some of those Northwest, a lot of typically Republican states where it tends to be a thing. And then some of them are just statistically irrelevant, such as Hawaii and Alaska, probably due to logistics. They were hard to get to. Or in other states, I think it was North Dakota that was one of them that was irrelevant. I don't really know why North Dakota. But as for going to the very positive ones like California and New York, there are a couple of reasons behind that. First off, they're big immigration influx areas. They generally have a lot of the low-skill labor market that tends to account for. Like New York, for instance, has as agriculture, it has all those different jobs that would fill in. California has the huge farming market. They have a lot of things that undocumented immigrants work for. Not to mention all of them also support a great deal of diversity. A lot of them support very progressive policy. So those were the general ideas, whereas the ones that were negative, such as like Utah, for instance, they're in very niche, faraway places from the typical illegal undocumented citizen border entry points, as well as the fact that there are typical conservative ideologies in a lot of those states, I feel does negatively hurt the ability for an undocumented citizen to perform well in their economy.
Mm-hmm. I mean, you're right. I mean, how could you work when when people support someone who's going to call you a rapist, a bad person, something like that?
I mean, more than just that, I imagine what he means by that, and you could correct me if I'm wrong, is that there is actual policy that may be in place, which prevents them from, it might be, stricter laws against allowing an undocumented worker to work for your company in, one state, like let's say North Dakota or something like that, where they might have more right-wing, people at the helms. And so that would definitely, I imagine, impact their ability negatively to benefit our GDP.
No, definitely. So, I guess going off of that, so Bob, you've kind of dispelled the myths of the economic myths of undocumented immigration. So I guess that really just leaves the social factor, right? And I mean, the social factor, why a lot of people should stray away from, because the social factor often pertains to the racist factor, right? If having undocumented immigrants, especially from Central American countries, come and it's good for the economy, what else is your argument? Your argument will have to be something based on social or something ethnic or racist. But I guess my question, Bob, is this was for all undocumented immigrants, right? This wasn't necessarily a particular race, ethnic group, or anything like that. So, in a way, that kind of deconstructs even more the economic myth, because not only is it transcends boundaries such as race and I'm sure gender and like ethnicity, but it just, the only way to, say undocumented immigration is bad is either, I don't know, I guess by saying, well, we don't want certain people of this ethnicity to come in our country, or I don't know, I guess the principle of law in a way. The whole idea that we want to have a border. Countries have borders, right? Great countries have borders. Mm-hmm. So anyway, I guess I want to talk more about that. This whole idea of border politics, right? So do great countries have borders? So our friend Jay actually has to leave. So
no, I just wanted to make one.
Okay.
I just wanted to run some numbers real quick, to add to what you said about the taxes being paid by the undocumented. The Border Angels website says this. According to the Social Security Administration's chief actuary, Stephen Seagoss, undocumented immigrants pay roughly $6 billion in federal taxes every year and are legally barred from using the services they help fund. Regarding state and local taxes, the Conservative Heritage Foundation estimated the undocumented paid $11.6 billion in 2013. This includes sales and excise, property, and personal income taxes. This adds up to a conservative estimate of $17.6 billion paid in state, local, and federal taxes every year.
Definitely. And I guess just to revise my question is because your statistics and Bob's research eliminates the whole economic myth about undocumented immigration, which leads to other weaker arguments such as the fact that the United States doesn't have enough land, which is completely untrue. Or, we're a great nation, we have to have borders, right? It leads to all these phony arguments that really lack any oomph behind them, right? I mean, most people care about the economy. That's the number one issue that people think about when they go to the polls. So it leads to these other arguments which it seems like this administration has really amplified in a way.
Well, I've talked about this a lot on the show before, where, you have abstraction of racial issues. So instead of directly saying, we hate the Mexicans or we hate the blacks, we're going to insist on programs that are, detrimental towards them because, economics, it's better for the economy. Oftentimes it isn't, but we'll say it anyway. And then B, because of some sort of social or moral failing of that community. Like, for example, we have an issue with welfare because, blacks are, being incentivized not to work. This just isn't true, right? But we'll say that, and we're doing the same thing for, the Latino community now because they've become a new scapegoat. But also, I think what you have is, you have people, when you mentioned that Trump is kind of, making it more known, right? Instead of using these dog whistles to appeal to mainstream conservatives who may not actually hold legitimately racist sentiment or anything like that, but may favor real conservative economic policy, instead of trying to appeal to them while also, on the side acknowledging with a wink and a glance, the alt-right, the white supremacists, he's really drawing them into the fold of the mainstream politics.
Definitely. And so that's something that's happened in the 70s, 80s, known as the Southern Strategy, correct? Whereas if instead of explicit racism, you do implicit. And interestingly, today, the House held a hearing about the rise of white nationalism and terrorist groups. So Candace Owens, a conservative black commentator who was there, who is controversial because she's been cited in the New Zealand terrorist attacks manifesto. She said that Hitler was only bad because he went beyond his boundaries, because he had globalist adventures. For some odd reasons, Republicans thought it was a good idea to invite her to talk about hate crimes.
Also, globalism, that's not what globalism even is.
Well, exactly, and I don't know what was going on. I don't know which congressperson brought her, but she stated that the Southern Strategy is a myth. It never existed.
Never? Well, what she buys into, the rhetoric of, someone like, what's his name? He's a Dinesh D'Souza, exactly. He buys into the logic of Dinesh D'Souza, who states things like the Democratic plantation is a thing. Realignment never really happened. And so if you look, all the data says, hey, in the 60s, Democrats supported civil rights to an extent. there were a few decades, the next 2 decades, where they were like kind of like tossed up. People who traditionally identified as Democrats were kind of alienated and didn't really know where to go, but eventually sorted themselves into the Republican Party. And to an extent, some Republicans who, supported racial justice, moved into the Democratic Party. So there's no denying it, and there's a wealth of statistical data and historical data that you can display to, just once again dispel that myth, which is all that it is. And it's one that you use so the Republican Party can continue saying that they are a race-blind ideology when, to quote Lee Atwater, whom I've quoted many times, you use abstraction because you can no longer say N-word, N-word, N-word by 1968. That starts to hurt you. So the fact of the matter is it really is just a euphemism, right?
No, definitely. So we're going to take a quick break again, and we're going to go back to Bob. Bob, I have a question for you, and I'll ask you right after the break. For those of you listening, thank you for listening to Sweep, and we'll be right back after this quick break.
For more easy ways to keep keeping your eyes healthy, see your optometrist or visit AOA.org.
Charlie.
Hey, did you see that play last night?
Unbelievable.
Yeah, and they still lost.
Sure.
You know, when I was playing, what we
What?
tried to...
You played in the street.
I played in the service. Anyway, what I'm trying to say is the kid, he should have...
Yeah, Hey, you okay?
I don't know.
Someone call 911!
2 out of 3 people with diabetes die of a heart attack or stroke. But you can lower the risk. Ask your healthcare provider how. For more info, go to diabetesactnow.org. Brought to you by the American Diabetes Association and the Ad Council.
Clutching the envelope tightly, I stepped onto the ladder at the bottom of the treehouse. Something caught my eye above me and I looked up. Light! It looked as if there were a firework display going on inside the treehouse. Crackling and snapping and whizzing sounds spun around above my head. Light shot out in sparks, dancing to the popping of noise. And then I looked up and saw... To find out what happens next, read Philippa Fisher's Fairy Godsister by Liz Kessler. Explore new worlds and check out more cool books at your local library. And visit read.gov, brought to you by the Library of Congress and the Ad Council.
You're listening to WVO of 88.5 Fairfield University, and this is The Sweep with yours truly, Haidar.
And I'm Cole Townsend.
And we're back. So as we're wrapping up things with our two lovely guests, Jay Glover and Bob George, we're going to transition back to you, Bob. Before the break, we were talking about, a little bit of Candace Owens and the hearings today about white nationalism and the fact that, the Southern strategy is still in play. And so my question for you, Bob, is, and we asked this of Jay earlier, so because we know that undocumented immigration helps the economy rather than hurts, what are some policy suggestions that you think could implement that the government could do, that society could do? Are there any things that come to your mind particularly, or?
Well, okay, so there's a little bit more. I got to unpack that a bit because of the fact that I don't even think the wall in the first place is fiscal policy at all. I mean, look, you have my research, you have other people's researches that show the fact that illegal immigrants or undocumented citizens are important for the U.S. economy, but I feel like this is more entirely of a white nationalist alt-right movement push made by Donald Trump. If you go to the GoFundMe page, there's actually a fund for the wall that's generated $20,865,300 in the past 3 months alone, and within the time frame of the sweep, people are donating as we speak.
Is that 20 million or 20 billion?
No, 20 million. Their goal is 1 billion.
Okay, so it's 20 million. Okay, I thought you said 20 billion.
No.
It sounds like they
funded already.
If that was the case, then the government shutdown wouldn't have happened in the first place.
And just to backtrack, I actually do think the wall is a form of fiscal policy because it is government spending in a way. Whether we can argue whether or not that's useful government spending, I don't think it is.
It's fiscal policy towards a symbolic gesture, I think is what Bob's getting at, and I wholeheartedly agree.
No, absolutely.
It's not fiscal policy that actually does great things for the economy. It's fiscal policy that draws significantly from our budget, from our resources, to create a monument and a testament to white nationalism in America.
For absolutely no reason, because we aren't in a recession right now. That's typically when government spends a lot of money, right? Keynesian economics. So anyway, Bob, like as you were saying, the GoFundMe and how the wall has become a symbol of white nationalism, which we all agree with you.
Yeah. No. Kind of going on. Colin basically generally agrees with me. Yes, the wall could be seen as fiscal policy. There's no denying it. Actually, there's the thing that President Trump was considering. He was talking about putting a bunch of solar panels on the wall as a showing of the fact that, like, the U.S. is trying to generate clean energy, and the fact that the wall is a lot more than just a wall. But in reality, if you think about it, the wall is more or less a symbol of America's closed border policy.
So the government won't subsidize solar panels on top of my roof, but they'll subsidize solar panels for the wall that hasn't even been built yet?
Believe me.
You want to talk about priorities.
Exactly
You want to talk about priorities. But anyway, Bob, continue.
Yeah. So going into that, you wanted to talk about the policy, right?
Yeah, any sort of policy suggestions in a way.
Right. So the main thing that makes the illegal immigrants a really interesting market, at least in the labor population, labor force participation, is because of the fact that they are undocumented. That allows them to very much get around a lot of like the inherent like labor laws and unions and a bunch of things like that. And the fact that it used to be extremely fluid. They basically would come in based on the demands of both the U.S. market, both U.S. labor market, as well as the labor markets of their own country. So one of the big things that I was trying to see is, like, how can we legitimize and make this, like, unique attribute, like, legitimate? And one of the ideas was rotating green cards, the idea of the fact that you could, like, kind of what Jay was saying earlier about how it used to be the fact that the border was really non-existent. You could just come in, come out as you please. And in order to do that, you would like go in, work for 3 months, come back to your family for a month, then go back work, and continuously doing this cycle. So I think the idea of pushing for easier access of green cards, temporary green cards, would be an extremely important policy change.
Actually, that's actually pretty smart, because you talk about how in California you have like seasons where people work, right? Migrant workers work.
Yeah.
Typically, some of these, I'm sure some of these undocumented workers have family over the border. So in a way, the U.S. could just allow these people to work in the season and allow them to go back to their family. I feel like that's one solution right there for the season workers, right? It's not the end-all solution.
Right.
It's just so interesting how we've been so paralyzed, right? Even Democrats, Republicans, it's either Republicans want a wall. That seems like to be like the standard party thing. I'm not sure. I can't think of any Republicans that might come out. Maybe like Justin Amash, who is a congressman.
Susan Collins, Jeff Flake. I know he retired, but come on, he's our hero.
Or, even Democrats, when Democrats are accused of having open borders, they really go, and there's no, we want border security, we want this, and that, which is super interesting to see how the parties are. So anyway, as we're wrapping up, so Jay, Bob, anything else you guys want to say, anything you want to mention about your trip, your research? This isn't going to be the last time we're going to see you all, I hope. You guys are welcome to come back on the suite, but any finishing remarks?
In terms of the policy change or procedural change, those temporary crossing visas such as family visas, employment visas, humanitarian visas, and lottery visas may have a 20-year waiting period or processing time. So, I mean, if there's any way to expedite those what have become limited pathways for entering the U.S., so that whole system needs to be modified.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah, I would generally just say, Jay was talking earlier about the fact that, like, you would have these people who would get, detained by ICE or wherever, and they would be in these detainment places that are just overfilling. And the general idea I have of that is, like, we should not separate these people from their families. They need to go back. So instead of, detaining them at this point, why not just send them back across the border, back with their family, drop them off at a certain point, and then they do whatever? I feel like that's a little bit more responsible. Other than that, I just wanted to point out the fact that it seems odd to me that the president has been generally going after the fact South American countries, especially Mexico in particular, when you realize the fact that there are a lot more illegal immigrants than just those who just come across the border. As Ali mentioned earlier, there are a lot of illegal immigrants who are nothing more than just people who overstay their visas, and a lot of these people are actually highly educated. So I feel like with this huge, big deal with immigration, why aren't these type of immigrants being addressed? Just some food for thought, I guess.
Absolutely. And to go on your point about, I think you're talking about catch and release in a way. I think the issue with that is most of the time these undocumented immigrants will come back, rightfully so, because why would you want to put them back into danger? But you do have some good points. Anyway, for those of you listening, thank you for listening to The Sweep. This episode has been our 8th episode, and it's been really well. Jay, Bob, thank you for coming on. For any new time listeners, we are on every Tuesday, 6 p.m. on WVF.org. We also upload our live recordings onto SoundCloud at the Sweep WOF, and on YouTube also at the Sweep WOF. And so we hope to see you next week, and thank you all so much for your support. Have a good one.
Have a nice night.